My name is Florence. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the steady one, the woman who keeps things running without asking for recognition. I live a quiet life now, the kind that doesn't draw attention unless you're really looking. People tend to assume they understand me within minutes. Calm, reasonable, dependable. The widow who handled her loss with grace, the woman who doesn't make scenes. They're not wrong, but they're not complete either. I've learned that when you don't raise your voice, people fill the silence with their own assumptions. They think calm means compliant, that patience means permission, that grief makes you smaller. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about drama, public confrontations, or clever one-liners delivered at the perfect moment. It's about something quieter than that, about how power actually shifts when no one is watching, and how dignity can be reclaimed without shouting a single word. What you're about to hear unfolded slowly over months, not days. At the center of it is loss, my husband's death, and the hollow disorientation that followed. But it's also about something else. What happened after? When the people closest to us made decisions that were never theirs to make. Decisions that seemed small to them, practical, harmless even, until they weren't. There's a moment in this story, one I'll come to later, when I recognized something that should never have left my possession. A small object, ordinary to anyone else, devastating to me. That moment didn't spark rage, it sparked clarity. And from that clarity came a series of choices, each one deliberate, each one quiet. I won't embellish what happened. I won't exaggerate motives or turn real people into villains. I'm telling this the way it felt from the inside, restrained, observant, and painfully aware of how easily a person can be erased if she allows it. If you're expecting a dramatic takedown, this may disappoint you. There are no shouting matches here, no triumphant speeches. What there is instead is an honest account of how respect is lost and how it can be reclaimed without asking for permission. I'm sharing this because I know I'm not the only one who's been underestimated during a vulnerable season. I know how common it is to be treated as a background character in your own life, especially when grief makes others uncomfortable. So before we begin, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever realized, too late, that people were making choices about your life because they assumed you wouldn't stop them? Before any of this happened, before documents, silence, or irreversible decisions, I was simply useful. That's the word I would choose now, looking back with distance. Not loved, not respected, not distrusted. Just useful, the kind of person people rely on without ever really seeing. To my late husband's family, I was good with details. The one who remembered dates, who organized paperwork, who made sure birthdays were acknowledged, and trains were booked on time. At gatherings, I was often placed at the edge of conversations, close enough to listen, far enough to be overlooked. If someone needed something done, a form filled out, a call made, they'd turn to me instinctively. But when decisions were discussed, real ones, weighty ones, those happened just slightly out of my reach. I don't say this with resentment. At the time, I didn't even name it. It was just the air we breathed. After my husband died, this perception of me didn't change. If anything, it settled into something more rigid. Grief, I learned, freezes people into the roles others are most comfortable assigning them. They saw a widow who was coping well. Too well, perhaps. I didn't cry in front of them. I didn't collapse. I handled arrangements quietly and efficiently. I thanked people for casseroles I couldn't taste. I listened while others reminisced, correcting dates when memories drifted too far from fact. That efficiency became evidence in their minds that I didn't need protecting or consulting. I was the calm one, the reasonable one, the woman who wouldn't make things awkward. In those early months, I noticed how often conversations would pause when I entered a room, then resume with a slight adjustment in tone. How plans were referred to vaguely. We've taken care of it. It's all sorted, without specifics. If I asked questions, the answers were reassuring but thin, as though detail might burden me unnecessarily. You've been through enough, someone once said gently when I pressed for clarification. It sounded like kindness. It wasn't meant unkindly, but it carried an assumption that would shape everything that followed. that my grief made me less entitled to agency. In their eyes, I had become fragile glassware. Valuable, yes, but better left untouched. Decisions should be made around me, not with me. And I let it happen. Not because I agreed with it, but because I was tired. Because in those months, simply getting through a day felt like an achievement. Because grief narrows your vision. You focus on survival, not boundaries. I told myself this was temporary, that once the dust settled, things would recalibrate. Those people were just trying to help in the only way they knew how. What I didn't realize then was that patterns once established don't dissolve on their own. They harden. Looking back now, I can see how neatly I fit the role they assigned me. I was polite. I didn't interrupt. I accepted explanations that were really conclusions. When something felt off, I filed the feeling away instead of naming it. And because I didn't object, my silence was interpreted as consent. There's a particular invisibility that comes with being competent and quiet at the same time. People stop checking in. They stop asking. They assume that if something truly mattered, you would say so. But grief doesn't always give you language right away. Sometimes all you have is a dull internal pressure, a sense that something is misaligned but not yet sharp enough to cut. That was who I was to them then. The woman who would understand. The woman who wouldn't complicate things. The woman whose calm could be relied upon not to disrupt the flow of other people's decisions. I didn't yet know how costly that assumption would become. At that stage, I still believed that being patient was the same as being wise, that time alone would correct misunderstandings, that my quiet presence was enough to signal that I mattered. I was wrong, but not in the way you might expect. Because what followed didn't begin with a dramatic betrayal. It began with something so small, so easily dismissed, that nearly everyone else forgot it happened at all. Everyone else except me. The first moment I can clearly point to didn't arrive with raised voices or obvious disrespect. It came disguised as efficiency. It was a conversation I wasn't meant to overhear. Or perhaps I was meant to, in the casual way people assume you aren't really listening. We were in my sister-in-law's kitchen months after the funeral. Cups of tea had gone cold on the counter. Papers were spread out, warranties, old instruction manuals, things that had been gathered with good intentions and no clear plan. I had stepped into the hallway to take a call, and when I returned, the conversation didn't stop. It just shifted slightly. "We've already taken care of most of it," she said to someone else, her voice light. There was no point letting things sit. I paused, not yet in the room listening. "Taking care of what?" When I asked, gently, she smiled in that reassuring way people use when they think they're protecting you from unnecessary strain. "Just some of his things," she said, "the practical stuff." It's remarkable how vague language can soften the sharpest edges. Some of his things. Practical stuff. I remember nodding. I remember saying something non-committal, probably, "Oh, okay." I remember how quickly the conversation moved on, as though nothing important had been said. But something in me tightened. Later, when I asked for clarification, I was told it was nothing sentimental. Old electronics. Tools he hadn't used in years. Items that would have just gathered dust. The explanation was delivered with a calm confidence that left little room for objection. And in that moment, I didn't object. I told myself I didn't need to monitor every detail. That they knew him too. That they were being helpful. That grief was making me overly sensitive. What I noticed instead and filed away was the absence of one simple thing: being asked. Not informed, not reassured after the fact. Asked. The cut was small, almost invisible, but it had a shape. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice similar moments. A coat mentioned in passing. "Oh, we donated that, hope that's all right." A box of books was relocated. A set of cufflinks no one could quite remember the origin of. Each time the same pattern: decision first, explanation later, always accompanied by a gentle tone, as though my approval was a formality rather than a requirement. I could see how it looked from the outside. A family tidying up, lightening the emotional load, making space. No one else saw harm in it. When I mentioned it to a friend, tentatively, she shrugged. "They probably thought they were helping," she said. "You've been through enough." That phrase again. What no one else could feel was the cumulative effect. Grief already fractures your sense of continuity. Objects become anchors, proof that a life existed as you remember it. When those anchors disappear without your consent, it's destabilizing in a way that's hard to articulate without sounding unreasonable. So I didn't articulate it. Instead, I observed. I started mentally reconstructing what had been where, what had been moved, what had been mentioned then quietly vanished. Not in a dramatic way, more like a background process running constantly, noting inconsistencies. At the time, I didn't yet call it disrespect. I called it miscommunication, oversight, good intentions poorly executed. But there was one detail that lingered longer than the others: a watch. I didn't realize it was missing at first. It was never kept in a display case or worn daily. It lived mostly in a drawer. But I remembered its weight, the way my husband handled it carefully, not because it was especially valuable, but because it marked time he couldn't replace. When I asked about it casually, the answer was immediate and confident. "Oh, that old thing, he didn't wear it anymore." Not "where is it?" He just didn't wear it anymore. I remember thinking that was a strange response to a question I hadn't quite finished asking. That was when I understood something important. Not everyone registers the same details as important. And those who move quickly through other people's lives often mistake silence for indifference. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't demand action. But it left a mark. And once you know where to look, you start seeing the pattern everywhere. What unsettled me most wasn't any single incident. It was how quickly they blended together, smoothing themselves into something almost ordinary. Once a boundary is crossed without consequence, it quietly redefines the landscape. After that first realization, I began to notice how often my presence was treated as optional. When it came to matters that directly affected me, conversations happened near me instead of with me. Updates replaced questions. Decisions were framed as fates accompli, already done, already settled, already too late to revisit without seeming unreasonable. And I, in turn, began to normalize it. I told myself I was being adaptable, mature, that this was what cooperation looked like after loss. I reasoned that pushing back would create tension at a time when everyone was already emotionally raw. I convinced myself that choosing peace meant choosing restraint. There is a dangerous comfort in that kind of logic. Because every time I accepted a decision retroactively, I trained them, without meaning to, that this was acceptable, that my consent could be assumed, that my silence meant alignment. It showed up in small ways. Items from the house were relocated without discussion. Documents referenced that I hadn't seen. A casual comment about sorting through the rest soon, said in a tone that implied inclusion, but offered no actual invitation. I would smile. I would nod. I would say things like, "just let me know," or "I trust your judgment." Those phrases became shields, convenient for them, costly for me. Internally, I felt a growing disconnect between what I was experiencing and how I was behaving. I could sense that something was wrong, but I hadn't yet given myself permission to name it. Naming it would have required friction. It would have required me to step out of the role I'd been assigned. So instead, I reframed. I told myself that objects were just objects. Those memories lived inside me, not in drawers or boxes. That insisting on control would make me seem petty or, worse, unstable. Grief already carries a stigma. I was determined not to confirm anyone's worst assumptions about widows being irrational or emotionally volatile. And so slowly, something shifted inside me. Not outwardly, but in how I processed what was happening. I began to watch more than I spoke. I noticed how often phrases like "we thought" and "we decided" were used, without any pause to consider whether I had been part of that "we." I noticed how efficiently my discomfort was bypassed by reassuring language. "You don't need to worry about that," someone would say. And I would think, but I wasn't worrying, I was asking. Each time I swallowed the urge to correct the record, I told myself it was temporary, that eventually when things settled, I could address it calmly and be heard. But what I didn't yet understand was that by waiting for the perfect moment, I was allowing the pattern to entrench itself. Disrespect rarely announces itself loudly. It prefers routine. It thrives on familiarity. What made it harder was that there was no malice, no raised voices, no clear villain, just a steady erosion of my role as the primary authority over my own life. And because it wasn't dramatic, it didn't feel justifiable to push back, at least not yet. So I adjusted internally instead. I began keeping quiet records, not written at first, just mental notes. Who said what? When something was moved? Which explanations were offered and which questions were avoided? Not because I planned to confront anyone, but because I needed to trust my own perception again. Grief can make you doubt yourself. It can make you wonder whether you're imagining slights that aren't really there. Keeping track, even privately, became a way of anchoring myself. Still, outwardly, I remained the same to them. Polite, agreeable, reasonable. And that consistency reassured them. It allowed them to believe that nothing was wrong, that everything they were doing was appropriate, even appreciated. I can see now how my silence functioned as lubrication, keeping the machinery of their decisions running smoothly. At the time, I thought I was choosing harmony. In reality, I was participating in my own marginalization. The normalization didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as cooperation, reinforced by my desire not to be difficult. But there's a point, subtle, almost imperceptible, when tolerance stops being generosity and starts becoming permission. I hadn't reached the breaking point yet, but I was getting closer. It took me longer than I care to admit to understand that what was happening wasn't situational. It was structural. I wasn't being overlooked accidentally, I was being positioned. Once you see the role others expect you to play, it becomes impossible to unsee it. In my case, the role was simple, efficient, and deeply limiting. The capable widow who would hold everything together without ever insisting on authorship. Reliable, useful, invisible. I realized this one afternoon during a family discussion that was never labeled as such. We were seated around a table, the conversation moving briskly, confidently, with the ease of people who assumed consensus. Matters were being discussed that directly involved me, my schedule, my access to certain documents, what should be kept aside, and what could be dealt with. No one asked whether I agreed. They didn't need to. They assumed I would adapt. I listened, nodding occasionally, and felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not sadness, but recognition. This was the role. This was how they saw me. I was the person who would fill gaps, not the one who would draw boundaries, the one who would smooth transitions, not question directions, the one who could be relied upon not to disrupt. And I understood then that this wasn't a temporary misunderstanding caused by grief. It was a convenient arrangement that benefited everyone except me. The clarity was unsettling, but it was also oddly grounding. Because once you understand the role, you can decide whether or not to continue playing it. At the time, I didn't stop them. Not outwardly. I continued to respond as expected. I didn't challenge assumptions. I didn't interrupt plans. What changed was internal. I stopped expecting consideration. That might sound bleak, but it was the opposite. Letting go of the expectation freed me to observe without disappointment. I no longer interpreted their behavior as a failure of kindness. I understood it as consistency, and consistency can be worked with. I began to notice how my reliability functioned as leverage, even if they didn't see it that way. I was the one with access to records, the one who knew where things had been stored, which accounts were active, which documents existed, and which were still missing. They relied on my competence while underestimating my agency. That underestimation was their mistake. Still, I didn't announce any change. I didn't confront them with my realization. I simply allowed the role to continue outwardly, because there was safety and predictability. People behave most carelessly when they believe you are harmless. I remained calm. I remained cooperative. I continued to be the person they expected me to be, but internally I began to redraw the map. I paid attention to language, who used we, who deferred to whom, who assumed authority without naming it. I noticed which requests were phrased as questions and which as expectations. I also noticed how rarely my emotional state was actually checked. People referenced my grief abstractly, as a concept, but rarely engaged with me directly about how I was coping. It was easier, I think, to treat me as stable furniture than as a changing human being. And I let them. Not because I was numb, not because I didn't care, but because I had begun to understand that visibility, in the wrong moment, is not always power. There's a particular kind of dominance that doesn't announce itself. It waits, it gathers information, it allows others to underestimate its reach. At this stage, I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I wasn't even sure what I wanted yet. I only knew that I would no longer rely on goodwill to protect what mattered to me. The role they assigned me, reliable, useful, invisible, came with access they didn't question. And access, when combined with clarity, becomes something else entirely. I was still playing my part, but I had stopped believing in it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic realization delivered in a single breath. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a place I had no emotional defenses left to guard. I was walking home through a side street I didn't usually take. The day was overcast, the kind of muted light that flattens everything into shades of gray. I remember this because it made the moment feel unreal, like a photograph drained of color. I passed a small cafe I'd never noticed before. There was a man standing just outside, adjusting his sleeve as he laughed at something on his phone. I would have walked past him without a second thought. Except for what was on his wrist, I recognized it instantly. Not because it was rare or flashy, but because I knew it intimately. The slight scratch near the clasp, the way the face caught light at a particular angle, the weight I remembered when I held it in my palm. My husband's watch. I stopped, not abruptly. I didn't gasp or confront the man. I simply paused, my body reacting before my mind caught up. In that moment, grief didn't surge. Anger didn't flare. Something else did. Certainty. There was no doubt, no rationalization, no, it looked similar. It was his. I knew it the way you know the sound of a loved one's footsteps in the dark. The man finished his call and stepped back inside. I didn't follow him. I didn't ask questions. I stood there longer than necessary, my thoughts moving with unusual clarity. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the end point of a series of decisions made without me. And suddenly, everything aligned. All the small cuts, all the vague explanations. The missing items were dismissed as insignificant. The watch I'd asked about was answered with deflection instead of information. I went home and sat down without turning on the lights. I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I opened my notebook, the one I'd been using sporadically, without much intention, and for the first time, I wrote with purpose. Dates, conversations, who said what when I'd asked, how I'd been answered. Not with anger, with precision. That afternoon marked a quiet but irreversible internal change. I stopped thinking in terms of hurt and started thinking in terms of facts. Facts are steadier. They don't fluctuate with emotion. They hold weight. I didn't yet know what I would do with what I was collecting. I only knew that something had been taken from me. Not just an object, but authority. And authority, once recognized as missing, must be addressed deliberately. What struck me most was how calm I felt. The realization didn't make me feel powerless. It made me feel awake. I understood then that silence, up until that point, had been reactive. I'd been quiet because I was unsure, because I didn't want to misjudge, because I was afraid of overstepping. Now silence became something else entirely. It became a choice. I didn't mention the watch to anyone. Not that day, not the next. I didn't ask follow-up questions or hint at what I'd seen. I let the knowledge settle, like sediment at the bottom of clear water. And in that stillness, I recognized something important. If I spoke too soon, I would be dismissed, reassured, told I was mistaken. But if I waited, if I understood the full scope of what had happened, I could respond in a way that couldn't be brushed aside. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else. I continued to show up as expected, polite, calm, cooperative. But internally, the axis had moved. I was no longer trying to be understood. I was preparing to be undeniable. After that afternoon, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been soft, pliable, reactive, shaped by uncertainty. Now it has become deliberate, structured, almost architectural. I didn't withdraw. That would have raised questions. Instead, I remained present in exactly the same ways as before. I answered messages promptly. I attended gatherings. I listened attentively. What changed was what I gave away. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped filling gaps in conversations. I let questions hang instead of smoothing them over with reassurance. When people assumed I would handle something, I waited to be asked directly. At first, no one noticed. Or perhaps they noticed but interpreted it as fatigue. Grief has a way of excusing many shifts in behavior. They mistook my restraint for depletion. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. Silence, when chosen consciously, creates space. And in that space, other people reveal more than they intend to. I listened carefully when plans were discussed. I paid attention to who spoke with confidence and who deferred. I noticed inconsistencies between stories told at different times to different people. And I noticed how often my absence from a conversation was used as justification for decisions made. She won't mind, someone would say. She's fine with it, another would add. No one checked. I didn't correct them. Instead, I began organizing what I knew. At home, I created a system. Nothing dramatic, just folders, timelines, cross-references. I reviewed documents I'd previously skimmed. I requested copies of records under the guise of tidying up. No one objected. Why would they? I was being responsible, helpful, exactly as expected. I learned something crucial during this period. People rarely guard against those they believe are aligned with them. They assume shared goals, shared values, shared silence, and so information flowed freely, not because I demanded it, but because I didn't challenge it. When someone mentioned having passed something along, I asked neutral follow-up questions. Not accusatory ones, clarifying ones, dates, names, locations. Each answer added a piece to the picture. Still, I felt no rush. There is a temptation, once you see clearly, to act quickly, to correct, to reclaim. But speed favors those who are already believed. I wasn't yet believed, so I let the silence do its work. Emotionally, this period was strange. I wasn't numb, but I wasn't raw either. The pain was still there, but it had been organized, contained within boundaries I could manage. Grief had taught me endurance. This phase taught me discipline. I also began to see how others interpreted my quiet as acquiescence. They grew bolder in their assumptions, more casual in their disclosures, less careful with their language. In a way, they did the work for me. I didn't celebrate these realizations. I didn't feel clever, mostly I felt resolved. There's a difference. I wasn't trying to outmaneuver anyone. I was trying to restore balance, to ensure that what had been taken without consent was addressed in a way that aligned with my values. And my values mattered more than ever. I wasn't interested in confrontation for its own sake. I wasn't interested in embarrassment or spectacle. I wanted clarity, accountability, and closure. Those things require patience. Silence, in this context, wasn't absence. It was presence without exposure. By the end of that phase, I had something I hadn't had before: a clear understanding of what had happened, who had been involved, and how casually my authority had been bypassed. I also understood something else. Once you choose silence intentionally, breaking it becomes a powerful act, but only if you choose the moment carefully. I wasn't there yet. What they never noticed was how much preparation can happen without noise. They mistook my calm for closure, my presence for compliance, my quiet for exhaustion. And because of that, they never saw the work taking shape just beneath the surface. I didn't suddenly become someone else. I simply returned to skills I had always had, skills that had once defined my professional life, before grief narrowed my world. My work had always revolved around records, provenance, chains of custody, knowing not just what existed, but where it came from, who had touched it, and how it moved from one place to another. At the museum, this was routine, methodical, almost boring. In my personal life, it became transformative. I began by reconstructing a timeline, not emotionally, but factually. I laid out the months following my husband's death and mapped every instance where an item had been mentioned, moved, donated, or taken care of. I cross-referenced conversations with calendar entries, text messages with receipts, casual remarks with logistical evidence. I didn't assume bad intent. I let the data speak. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain people appeared repeatedly at transition points. Certain explanations are repeated with minor variations. And certain items, always described as practical, unused, or not sentimental, had a habit of leaving my orbit permanently. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I learned. I researched estate processes, not because I planned legal action immediately, but because I wanted fluency. I wanted to understand exactly where authority began and ended, and where assumptions had been allowed to substitute for permission. The language mattered, the definitions mattered, timing mattered, and no one questioned why I was asking. To them, I was doing what I'd always done, handling details. I requested inventories under the pretense of organizing. I asked for names of charities and secondhand shops for my records. I followed trails that led to places I'd never thought to look before. Sometimes the answers were incomplete. Sometimes they were confidently wrong. Both were useful. Emotionally, this phase was quieter than you might expect. There was no satisfaction in uncovering what had been done, no sense of triumph, just a steady accumulation of clarity. Clarity can be sobering. What surprised me most was not the behavior itself, but how unremarkable it was to everyone else. These weren't secretive acts carried out in shadows. They were casual decisions, made quickly, justified easily, and forgotten almost immediately. That forgetfulness was part of the problem, because what's forgotten by one person can remain painfully present to another. As I documented, I also paid attention to myself. I noticed how different this felt from the early months of grief. Then I had felt unmoored, adrift in other people's interpretations of what I needed. Now I felt anchored, not because I was controlling everything, but because I was finally accounting for it. There were moments of temptation, moments when I thought about revealing what I knew just to see the reactions. But I resisted. Reactions weren't the goal. Understanding was. I also began quietly repositioning myself. I changed how I responded to assumptions. When someone said, "You'll handle that," I replied, "Let's talk about it later." When plans were described as settled, I asked who had been consulted. Always calmly, always without accusation. Those small shifts registered, but not alarmingly. They were interpreted as me finding my footing again, which wasn't wrong, just incomplete. What they never noticed was how their continued underestimation gave me time. Time to verify, time to confirm, time to decide what mattered most. Because by this point, I understood something critical. Not every wrong requires exposure. Not every betrayal requires confrontation. But every erosion of agency requires a response. And that response must be aligned with who you want to be on the other side of it. By the end of this phase, I had a complete picture, not just of what had been taken, but of how casually my role had been reduced in the process. I also had something else: leverage, not the explosive kind, not the kind that humiliates or destroys, the kind that restores balance quietly. And once you see that balance is possible, you can't unsee it. The moment of private revelation didn't arrive with surprise. It arrived with confirmation. By the time it happened, I already suspected the shape of the truth. What I needed, what I waited for, was certainty solid enough to carry weight without emotion. It came through a name. I had been following a trail that seemed at first unpromising. A charity shop mentioned in passing. A vague reference to a man who might appreciate it. An offhand remark about how it's better if things are used than locked away. None of it sounded malicious. None of it sounded deliberate. But when I traced the watch, quietly, indirectly, it led me to a private resale network I hadn't expected. Not an auction house, not a pawn shop, a closed loop of collectors and resellers who operated almost entirely on trust and familiarity. And there it was. Not listed publicly, not advertised widely, but documented. The watch hadn't been donated. It had been sold. That fact landed differently than I expected. There was no rush of vindication, no emotional spike, just a deep, steady stillness. Because selling it meant something specific. It meant someone had decided, not impulsively, not carelessly, that this object had value, enough value to convert into money, enough value to move intentionally, not discard. And they had done so without consulting me. The revelation wasn't just about the watch. It was about the story that had been told around it. The way its disappearance had been framed as inconsequential. The way my question had been deflected rather than answered. I sat with that knowledge for a long time before doing anything else. I didn't print documents, I didn't make calls, I didn't even write it down immediately. Instead, I asked myself one question over and over: what do I want to restore here? It wasn't the watch itself, though that loss still ached. It wasn't money. It wasn't even an apology. What I wanted was acknowledgement of agency. I wanted it to be clear, without dramatics, without cruelty. The decisions about my life and my husband's legacy could not be made around me again. That clarity shaped everything that followed. I continued to gather confirmation quietly. I verified dates. I cross-checked transactions. I confirmed that the sale hadn't violated laws, but had crossed something more subtle: consent. I also confirmed something else: the narrative they believed about me. They thought I didn't know, that I wouldn't notice, that even if I did, I would choose peace over friction, silence over correction. In other words, they believed the role they'd assigned me was permanent. That belief was the real leverage, because leverage doesn't always come from what you can expose. It often comes from what others assume you won't. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't hint. I didn't change my demeanor. Outwardly, nothing shifted. Inwardly, everything did. I understood then that I had reached a point of no return. Not because I intended to act aggressively, but because I could no longer unknow what I knew. From that moment on, any silence I maintained was no longer about self-protection. It was about strategy. And strategy requires decisions, not impulsive ones, not reactive ones, irreversible ones. I knew I would act, I just hadn't yet decided how. Knowing gives you power. Choosing how to use it gives you responsibility. I spent weeks at the decision point, not because I was uncertain about what had happened, but because I was precise about what I refused to become. There were options available to me, clear ones, loud ones. I could confront them directly, demand explanations, and force apologies that would come tangled with defensiveness and justification. I could expose the sale publicly within the family, letting embarrassment do the work for me. I could even pursue legal remedies, not because they would devastate anyone, but because they would formalize the wrongdoing in a way that couldn't be ignored. All of those paths were open. None of them felt right, not because they were wrong, but because they centered the reaction. They would have kept me orbiting their behavior, their explanations, their version of events. I wanted something else. I wanted finality without spectacle. I wanted a response that didn't require emotional labor from me, or ongoing negotiation, or repeated explanations of why something mattered. I wanted to move the axis, not argue over where it should be. So I asked myself different questions. What outcome would prevent this from ever happening again? What action would make my authority undeniable without humiliating anyone? What choice would still feel clean years from now? The answer didn't arrive all at once. It emerged slowly, as the implications of my options settled. I realized that the real issue wasn't the watch, it was access. They had access to spaces, to objects, to information that should have been conditional, not assumed. And I had allowed that access to continue out of habit and goodwill. That was the point of leverage. So the irreversible choice I made was not confrontational. It was structural. I began quietly disentangling systems. I changed permissions. I updated the records. I reassigned points of contact. I clarified authority in writing, not as an accusation, but as an update. I didn't announce these changes. I didn't justify them. I implemented them calmly, legally, and thoroughly. Each action on its own seemed minor, administrative, sensible. Together, they shifted the balance completely. This wasn't revenge. It was recalibration. I didn't need them to admit fault for this to work. I didn't need agreement. I needed alignment with my own values and with reality. Emotionally, this was the hardest part. Not because I doubted myself, but because finality carries weight. Once you make certain changes, you can't pretend things are the way they were before. And I wasn't trying to preserve comfort. I was trying to preserve integrity. I remember one evening in particular, sitting alone after completing one of the last steps. I felt a quiet grief, not for what had been done to me, but for the version of family I had hoped for. The one where trust didn't require oversight. Letting go of that hope was part of the decision, but in its place came something steadier. Agency. I hadn't yet seen the consequences. I knew they would come. Systems resist change. People notice when access disappears. But I wasn't bracing for fallout. I was ready for it. Because the decision had already done its work inside me. Everything that followed would simply reveal what had already shifted. When you move quietly, the absence of reaction can feel unsettling at first. I had made my decision. I had set changes in motion, and yet, on the surface, nothing happened. No messages, no sudden questions, no confusion voiced out loud. That's the thing about structural change. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. I continued my routine. I attended the same gatherings. I responded with the same calm tone. I listened more than I spoke. If anything, I became easier to be around, less reactive, less emotionally demanding. That too worked in my favor. Behind the scenes, however, access was narrowing. I updated legal points of contact so that any decisions involving property, records, or personal effects required my direct authorization. I consolidated documentation into systems that I controlled. I formalized boundaries that had previously existed only as assumptions. Each step was legitimate, transparent, defensible. And because it was done without drama, it raised no immediate alarms. People tend to notice conflict, not clarity. I also stopped compensating for other people's gaps. When someone didn't know where something was, I didn't rush to help. When a process stalled, I didn't step in to fix it automatically. I allowed friction to exist, not as punishment, but as information. And slowly I felt the shift. Requests that had once been casual became tentative. Assumptions softened into questions. We usually turned into, would it be all right if... Still, no one connected these changes to me. They were attributed to circumstances, to timing, to things being different now, which they were. What struck me during this phase was how quickly people feel the loss of access without understanding why. There's a subtle discomfort that arises when familiar routes no longer work, when shortcuts disappear, when systems that once bent easily suddenly require permission. And because I hadn't explained myself, there was nothing to argue against. Silence leaves no surface for resistance. Emotionally, I stayed steady. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I didn't anticipate confrontations. I trusted the process I had set in motion. That trust was new for me. In the past, I had relied on goodwill, on the assumption that if I stayed reasonable, things would work themselves out. Now, I rely on structure. Structure doesn't care how you feel, it just functions. There was one moment, though, when I realized the silence was working exactly as it should. A relative mentioned, almost casually, that they couldn't locate something they had always had access to before. The comment wasn't accusatory, just puzzled. I nodded, I said nothing. The conversation moved on, but I saw it then, the first ripple. What I was doing wasn't invisible anymore. It just wasn't yet named. And that distinction mattered. Because once something is named, people scramble to control the narrative around it. They explain, they justify, they rewrite history. I wasn't interested in that. I wanted the consequences to speak for themselves. As the weeks passed, small inconveniences accumulated. Delays, missed assumptions, quiet recalibrations. And still I said nothing. Not out of fear, but because I didn't need to. Power, I was learning, doesn't always come from asserting yourself loudly. Sometimes it comes from withdrawing availability and letting reality reassert its shape. By the end of this phase, I could feel the balance had changed. Not dramatically, not explosively, but definitely, the silence had done its work. And soon, they would begin to feel the consequences without fully understanding where they came from. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded the way quiet systems always do, incrementally, impersonally, without emotion. At first, it showed up as confusion. Someone mentioned a delay in accessing paperwork they usually handled. Another complained that a process felt more complicated than it used to be. The tone was mild, almost amused, as though the inconvenience were temporary or administrative. I listened. I nodded. I offered neutral responses. Oh, that's odd. I'm sure it'll sort itself out. What I didn't do was step in to smooth it over, and that absence was felt. Soon, confusion turned into mild frustration. Emails were sent asking for clarification. Phone calls were placed, careful in tone but edged with uncertainty. "Do you know who we should speak to about this now?" someone asked. "Yes," I replied calmly. "Me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not resistance, just recalibration. From that point on, the pattern shifted more noticeably. Requests that had once been framed as updates now arrived as questions. Decisions that had once been announced now waited, unresolved, for confirmation. Still, no one referenced the past directly. No one mentioned the watch. No one acknowledged that something fundamental had changed. Instead, they reacted to the present, and the present was no longer organized around their convenience. I watched as small dependencies became visible. Dependencies they hadn't realized existed because I had previously absorbed the friction silently. Without that buffer, inefficiencies surfaced. Miscommunications multiplied. Processes slowed. None of it was catastrophic. That was important to me. I wasn't trying to cause harm. I was allowing natural consequences to emerge. Emotionally, this phase was unexpectedly quiet. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. There's a particular peace that comes from no longer explaining yourself to people who never asked in the first place. As the weeks went on, I noticed a subtle change in how I was addressed. My opinions were sought earlier. My responses were awaited. My absence from a conversation was no longer assumed to be irrelevant, and still no one confronted me. I think part of them sensed, without articulating it, that whatever shift had occurred wasn't accidental, that pushing too hard might expose something they weren't ready to examine. There was one moment during a family gathering that crystallized this for me. A discussion began about what should be done next. As usual, several voices overlapped confidently. Then, mid-sentence, someone stopped and looked at me. "What do you think, Florence?" they asked. The room went quiet. Not dramatically, just attentively. I answered calmly, briefly, without justification. and the conversation reorganized itself around my response. That was when I knew the consequences had fully begun. Not as punishment, not as revenge, as recognition. What struck me most was how little needed to be said. No explanations, no history lessons, no emotional appeals, just presence. The systems I had adjusted were doing their work. The boundaries I had clarified were holding. And the people who had once assumed my silence meant consent were now adapting to a reality where it didn't. Some of them didn't like it. I could feel that, but discomfort is not the same as injustice. And I wasn't responsible for managing their feelings anymore. By the end of that phase, the balance had shifted visibly enough that avoidance was no longer possible. The question was no longer whether something had changed. It was how they would respond to it. That response was coming, and when it did, it would be too late to undo what had already been set in place. Panic doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it arrives as over-politeness, as sudden warmth, as an eagerness to clear the air without ever naming what clouded it in the first place. That was how I recognized it. The messages began changing tone. Invitations were phrased more carefully. Words like misunderstanding, oversight, and family appeared more frequently, like offerings placed gently on a table. No one accused me of anything. No one challenged the new reality directly. Instead, they circled it. There were attempts to revisit old conversations, retold with softened edges. Decisions that had once been spoken of confidently were now described as collaborative, even when they hadn't been. "I thought we'd agreed," someone said once tentatively. I looked at them calmly. I don't remember agreeing to that. I didn't say it sharply. I didn't say it defensively. I said it truthfully. And the truth landed heavier than any accusation could have. I could see the recalculations happening in real time. The realization that the narrative they'd been operating under, the one where I was passive, flexible, endlessly understanding, no longer applied. They tried in small ways to regain ground. Suggestions were made about going back to how things were, offers to handle things together, even a few subtle attempts at guilt, references to how difficult everything had been for everyone. I listened. I acknowledged the difficulty. But I didn't reopen doors. Because what they didn't yet understand was that the moment for fixing it informally had passed, long before they noticed anything was wrong. The damage wasn't just the sale of the watch or the removal of belongings. It was the assumption that my role in my own life was optional. Once that assumption exists, trust doesn't return easily. There was a particular conversation that marked the point of no return. Someone asked, carefully, almost nervously, whether I was upset about how things were handled after. It was the closest anyone came to naming it. I considered my answer carefully. "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm clear." That distinction mattered. Upset implies emotion that can be soothed. Clarity implies understanding that doesn't require agreement. They nodded slowly. I could see the disappointment there. Not in me, but in the realization that reassurance wasn't coming. After that, the attempts to smooth things over became less frequent. People began to accept that the structure had changed, even if they didn't like it. Some tried to rationalize it privately. Others distanced themselves slightly, uncertain how to engage with this version of me. I allowed that distance, not as punishment but as honesty, because I wasn't interested in maintaining closeness built on misalignment. What struck me most during this phase was how often people assume things can be repaired simply because they're willing to talk, without recognizing that timing is everything. Repair requires accountability. It requires acknowledging not just that something happened, but why it mattered. No one was willing to do that, and so nothing could be reversed. Emotionally, I felt something unexpected, relief. Not relieved that they were uncomfortable. Relief that I no longer had to carry the burden of explaining my worth. I didn't need them to understand every step I had taken. I needed them to respect the outcome, and they did, because they had no other choice. By the end of this stage, the energy had shifted completely. The urgency faded. The panic settled into resignation. The systems held. The boundaries remained intact. And what had once been casual access was now formal, intentional, and limited. It was too late to fix it the old way, but that was the point. Because the old way had never worked for me. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no dramatic pauses, no rehearsed speeches delivered with shaking hands. Just a conversation, long overdue, held in a calm room with even tones and nowhere left to hide. It happened because someone finally asked directly, not aggressively, not defensively, just carefully, as if testing the ground. "Did we do something to upset you?" I noticed the phrasing immediately. Upset, emotional, temporary. I didn't correct it. I simply answered. There were decisions made without me, I said, about things that weren't yours to decide. The room went quiet, not tense, just attentive. This was new territory. I could feel that. Someone tried to soften it. We thought we were helping. I know, I replied. Intent doesn't replace consent. That was all I said. No examples, no lists, no mention of the watch, no need to prove anything. The power of that moment wasn't in what I revealed. It was in what I didn't have to. They waited, perhaps expecting more. An explanation, a justification, a release of emotion they could respond to. It didn't come. Another voice entered the space, gently. If we'd known it mattered. It didn't matter, I said calmly. You just didn't ask. That landed. I could see it in the way shoulders shifted, in the way eye contact broke and reformed. The realization wasn't about guilt, it was about recognition. For the first time, the issue wasn't framed as my reaction. It was framed as their assumption. No one argued after that. There were apologies, quiet ones, imperfect ones. Some were sincere, some were attempts at closure without discomfort. I accepted none of them formally. I didn't reject them either. I'm not here for apologies, I said. I'm here so this doesn't happen again. That was the boundary. The conversation didn't last long after that. It didn't need to. Everything essential had been said without being expanded. When it ended, there was no resolution in the traditional sense. No hugs, no promises of doing better. But something more important had happened. The dynamic had been named. And once named, it couldn't retreat back into ambiguity. As I left, I felt no surge of victory, no satisfaction, just a quiet confirmation that I had handled it the way I wanted to, without heat, without cruelty, without performing pain for legitimacy. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't shared evidence. I hadn't demanded understanding. I had simply stated reality, and that was enough. Because confrontation doesn't have to be explosive to be final. Sometimes the calmest version is the one that leaves the deepest mark. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was then. That's important to say. I didn't become colder. I didn't become harder. I didn't transform into someone unrecognizable. What changed wasn't my nature, it was my orientation. I no longer organized myself around being convenient. For a long time, my identity had been built quietly around usefulness, being the one who remembered, the one who adapted, the one who absorbed discomfort so others wouldn't have to. I told myself that this was generosity, and sometimes it was. But too often, it was erasure dressed up as kindness. Now I understand the difference. I still value calm. I still listen carefully. I still choose restraint over reaction. But none of those things comes at the expense of my authority anymore. I don't wait to be invited into conversations that concern me. I don't assume good intentions will substitute for clear boundaries, and I don't offer silence as a placeholder for consent. What surprised me most after everything settled was how peaceful this version of myself feels. Not vindicated, not triumphant, aligned. There's a steadiness that comes from knowing you will not abandon yourself to preserve comfort, that you will not explain your worth to people who benefit from underestimating it. Some relationships didn't survive the shift. They became distant, formal, careful. That loss used to frighten me. Now, I see it clearly. Closeness that depends on your invisibility is not closeness at all. Other relationships recalibrated, slowly, awkwardly, but with a new respect that didn't require constant maintenance. Those are the ones I keep. Grief is still part of me. That hasn't disappeared. I still miss my husband in quiet, ordinary ways, at the end of the day, in the middle of a sentence, in moments that no one else sees. But that grief no longer defines my posture in the world. I don't move through life braced for impact anymore. I don't preemptively soften my needs. I don't assume that being calm means being secondary. I've learned that quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-trust. It's about knowing when to speak and when to let systems do the talking. About choosing clarity over chaos. About understanding that respect doesn't come from being indispensable. It comes from being unmistakable. I also understand now that justice doesn't always look like exposure. Sometimes it looks like a structure, like permanence, like decisions that don't need to be announced because they're already in effect. The watch was never returned to me, and I made peace with that. Not because it didn't matter, but because my response honored what it represented more than possession ever could. What mattered was reclaiming authorship over my life. Who I am now is a woman who notices everything, but reacts only when it counts. A woman who doesn't rush to correct people's assumptions, unless those assumptions threaten her agency. A woman who understands that silence, when chosen freely, can be a form of power. I don't regret how I handled any of it, and that more than anything else tells me I chose well. There's a moral people often reach for in stories like this. Something neat about standing up for yourself loudly, or confronting wrongdoing the moment it appears. That wasn't my lesson. What I learned is quieter, and perhaps harder to practice. I learned that dignity doesn't require performance, that you don't have to narrate your pain for it to be real, or dramatize your boundaries for them to hold. You don't owe anyone an emotional display in order to justify your authority. Silence, when it's chosen deliberately, is not weakness. It's discernment. For a long time, I thought being fair meant being endlessly accommodating. I thought patience would naturally invite respect. I thought that if I stayed calm and reasonable, others would eventually meet me there. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes people meet you exactly where you allow them to. The moment you stop filling in the blanks for others, stop explaining, stop smoothing, stop making yourself easy to bypass, something shifts. Not always immediately, not always comfortably, but it shifts. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from structure, from quiet decisions that realign power without humiliating anyone, from choosing actions that make certain behaviors impossible to repeat. And there's a deeper kind of peace in that than there is in winning an argument. I don't tell this story to suggest one right way to respond to being dismissed or overstepped. Everyone's circumstances are different. Everyone's thresholds are different. But I do want to leave you with this thought. If someone is making decisions about your life without you, it's rarely because they're cruel. More often, it's because they've learned, consciously or not, that you won't stop them. That realization isn't an accusation. It's an invitation to decide what you will and won't allow going forward, to choose clarity over comfort, to trust yourself enough to let your actions speak where explanations would only be argued with. You don't have to become louder to become stronger. You don't have to harden yourself to hold your ground. Sometimes, all it takes is stepping out of the role you were assigned and refusing to step back into it. If this story resonated with you, I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where you realized, quietly, that people had been deciding your limits for you? And what did you do next?
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.